A detail I always enjoyed in Dark Souls 3 is that every single Lord of Cinder, the Abyss Watchers, Aldridge, Yorm, and even Lothric, have second phases wherein they become engulfed in flames. Now, is there a lore explanation for how this happens? Sure. But ever the contrarian, I'm a lot more interested in why it happens. This was a deliberate creative choice, and I think it's worth asking what it might communicate to us about these characters, about the battles taking place. Put simply, the Lords of Dark Souls 3 are prisoners. Each of them has been called to link the fire, and each of them has refused. They are willing lords no longer. But regardless of what they want, the fire is fading, and someone has to link it or kill it, and to that end, the lords all need to die. No matter how far or how fast they run, the fire will always catch up to them. When first confronted, they appear pretty normal, if a bit decrepit, and it's only when you get to the second phase of each fight that the flames appear. The second phase means you've got them on the ropes. This is the point at which it's clear that fate is catching up. Fire is, of course, the very thing they rejected. And this fatalist imagery gets a lot more explicit in the DLC with Frida. Like the others, Frida was called to link the fire. She was an unkindled, and she fled from this duty. But she was also a sister of the Church of Londor, dedicated to the usurpation of flame and the emergence of a new humanity. And this fate, too, she rejected. Once again, her second phase sees her swallowed by the flames that she loathes, and in her case, these flames carry a dual meaning. In one sense, they bear the weight of her identity as an unkindled, a lord seeker, and in another, the existential threat to Ariandel, her home, which she fights to suppress. But in either case, the flames are ultimately an embodiment of fate. They are the fate from which she runs, the freedom she's been denied. The reason she is so determined to kill you is to keep the flames buried, to keep her fate at bay. Then, during her third phase, the orange flames give way to the black flame of humanity, of Londor, the other identity Frida rejected, the other fate she tried desperately to outrun. I really like this kind of tragic visual storytelling, and I love the idea of bosses whose designs, visually or mechanically, reflect their fears and reflect their fates. And today, I want to share those thoughts with you. I thought for a long time about how I wanted to structure this video, and eventually gave up entirely. I thought about doing it alphabetically, but as you'll see, a lot of the bosses in this video won't be covered alone, but in relation to other characters in the series. I thought about organizing them by which entry in the series they appeared in, but that wouldn't have worked super well either for exactly the same reason. In a lot of cases, what I find so interesting about these characters and their design stems, at least in part, from their interplay with other characters and concepts in the series. This is all to say that the bosses in this video will be appearing in a random order I cooked up in my nightmares. That is unfortunately the best I could do. A couple of quick disclaimers. First of all, I won't be covering every boss in the series, at least not in this video. I want to cover my favorites, but there are tons of great characters in this series, and if I don't cover your favorite, it's not personal, nor does it mean I think the other bosses are uninteresting. Of course, these are all my own opinions and my own interpretations of these characters. So if you disagree or have your own thoughts, that's all good, I'd love to hear them, and I'm sure others would as well. Of course, please be kind to one another in the comments. You care about these games, I guarantee the fucker you're arguing with does too. Major spoilers ahead for the Dark Souls trilogy, and also potentially some very minor spoilers for Elden Ring and the Bible. And with that incredibly long and boring intro out of the way, let's get started. The Rotten is one of the four Great Ones in Dark Souls 2, the inheritor of the soul of Gravelord Nito. Per its soul's description, the Rotten embraces all, in the sanctuary for all things unwanted or tossed away. The Rotten is an amalgamation of decaying undead, these pitiful things which the world detests above all else. Despite its disturbing appearance, the description of the Rotten's soul and its in-game behavior suggests its actions are intended as benevolent. The Rotten welcomes the undead, which the world above cannot bear to look upon. And when first we see the creature, it's trying to fix a broken idol, to put things back where they belong, and growing frustrated at its inability to do so. And this gesture, to me, is at the very core of the Rotten's identity. Few creatures in the Souls series are as profoundly unsettling as the Rotten, and I think a lot of that has to do with how unknowable it is. The Rotten clearly wishes to make a home for these lost undead, and in a sense it has. But as they writhe and flail in their cage, as their arms reach out from its depths, it seems more and more that they've been imprisoned. And why exactly are they flailing? Are they in agony? Or are they simply beckoning you to join them? And for that matter, why exactly does the Rotten attack you? Does it wish to banish you from its sanctuary? Does it see you as a threat? Or does it wish to make you a part of it? You are undead, after all. The world no longer has need of you. With a single sentence and a clever, ambiguous design, the Rotten becomes the embodiment of the state and fear of undeath, its tragedy, its unknowability. But I think the Rotten is even more interesting in relation to Gravelord Nito. See, while it is true that Gwyn sought to prolong the Age of Fire, I don't think he truly had respect for what that meant, for the totality of its meaning. Death is a function of the Age of Fire. It is one of the many disparate forces which came into being when Flame was born.
Heat and cold, life and death.
And during the reign of the gods, it was the domain of Gravelord Nito. And when Gwyn branded mankind, he removed death from the equation, from its rightful place in the Age of Fire. Nito is referred to in this game by the Finito as he who gave us the first death. And it is the job of both the Finito and Milfinito to comfort the dead and the dying, to revere death's peaceful embrace. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, to comfort the undead, those who cannot die. Nito was an amalgamation of the bones of those who had been allowed to wilt and decay, but there are no such people anymore, or very few of them anyway. There are only those afflicted by the curse, writhing and suffering forever. There are no longer lords of the dead, only lords of the undead. The former has no place in a world which denies death itself. Perhaps more so than any of the other lords, I get the sense that the soul which possesses the Rotten truly is the soul of the Gravelord. What else could a Gravelord become in a world robbed of death? We've seen how much Gwyn cherished the gift of light, what it drove him to do. Likewise, we saw how much Izalith cherished the gift of life, how much she was willing to risk for it. And in the Rotten, we are finally able to see how much Nito cherished death, the closure and peace that it brings. And because he can no longer offer it, because it is a gift which mankind has been denied, all that's left for him to do is to welcome the undead with open arms and try his very best to comfort them. To make his domain, his very being, a home, to make himself a sanctuary. On first pass, the Iron Golem might appear a bit uninteresting. A test for the player canonized as a test for our character, but it shares a commonality with the giants of Dark Souls 2, which I find very interesting. The Iron Golem isn't a man or a monster, just a mindless, empty machine. A simulacra of something real. It was designed as a part of Gwyn's plan, and it's a straightforward embodiment of the present Age of Fire. Empty and meaningless, a shadow of the great and terrible figures who once walked the land. Just like the city it was built to guard, everything awe-inspiring about the Golem exists on the outside, on the very surface level. It is worthless and empty and degraded, as all who are denied an end eventually will be. The perfect guardian for the Age of Fire. The Iron Golem isn't particularly interesting for what it is, but for what it isn't. Its value is in what it reveals about Gwyn and about his choices. And I think the giants in Dark Souls 2 are interesting for much the same reason. Who exactly the giants were, what their culture was like, what they wanted, none of that is as important to me as what they were in Vendrick's mind. Fear. Nashandra warned Vendrick about a looming threat, about the giants on the other side of the sea, and regardless of Nashandra's motivations, Vendrick took this threat seriously enough to launch a full-scale invasion of their territory. And it paid off. Vendrick was victorious. He even commandeered the giant's strength and made it his own. But in the end, the giants came for him anyway. They rebuilt their strength and came to take revenge for what Vendrick had done. They brought wrack and ruin to Drangleic, and by the time they were defeated, his once great kingdom was rubble. The giants are an embodiment of Vendrick's fears, fears which no amount of strength could overcome. There is no military might, no impregnable fortress which could have put his mind at ease, because like all of the game's fallen kings, Vendrick was just a man, and so bound by the undead curse. A fear which is all-encompassing and totalizing, and which has no remedy. Either cling to fire knowing full well what it will do to you, or destroy the flame, and embrace the terror of the unknowable. Of course, Vendrick couldn't choose either. He lacked the strength of will, and so was overcome by his fears. Vendrick lost his mind, hollowed away deep within the earth, and the giants destroyed all that he had built. Dark Souls 2's giants have some of the most striking and uncanny designs I've ever seen, and that's because they have no faces, just empty black holes where their faces ought to be. Black holes which look suspiciously like the dark sign, the augur of darkness, the festering sickness in Vendrick's heart which he could never overcome. Like the Iron Golem, I feel that the most interesting thing about these titans isn't who they are, but who they were in the mind of the king of this once great land. Aldia has always been one of my absolute favorite characters in Dark Souls, and he also has one of my absolute favorite designs. Aldia, the brother of King Vendrick and scholar of the First Sin, desperately wanted to escape the cycle of fire linking, but his conscience wouldn't allow it. Even though he knew what Gwyn had done and what man had been reduced to, Aldia loved life, and life as he understood it was tethered to flame. Even if his desires were not his own, even if they were forced upon him by Gwyn, they remained his desires, and so he couldn't bring himself to snuff out the flames. You could tell him he belonged in an age of dark, that he was meant to be something more, but you couldn't make him believe it.
All men trust fully the illusion of life. But is this so wrong? A construction, a facade, and yet a world full of warmth and resplendence. Young Hollow, are you intent on shattering the yoke, spoiling this wonderful falsehood?
But Aldia wasn't willing to link the flames either. Miraculously, Aldia managed to break the undead curse, but at the cost of his corporeal form, and, we may infer, at the cost of the very same trivialities which he had hoped to protect. By the time you meet him, Aldia is unrecognizable, a tangled web of branches and roots wreathed in flame. If you look closely, you can just barely make out a face somewhere inside the mass. I always felt this tree-like design was a fitting choice for a character unbound by time. Trees are a constant motif in FromSoft games, though until very recently they've been resigned to the realm of imagery and inference. Very little was ever clarified about their role in the Dark Souls trilogy, though in a sense, that's precisely why I think they're so fitting for Aldia's transformation. The archtrees of Dark Souls are omnipresent. They have existed since before the dawn of time. They, alongside the ancient dragons, are the oldest known beings in existence. But unlike the ancient dragons, they pose no material threat to Gwyn's ambitions, and so, rather than being cut away, remain in a peaceful stasis at the core of the world. They are the very bedrock of reality, the roots of the world itself, the owners of all of the knowledge which Aldia seeks. Aldia was obsessed with the ancient dragons, and he even tried to recreate one, and it's my own belief that he did this because he wanted to know what they know, because he thought it could help him break the curse, could illuminate the proper path for him to follow. Eventually, Aldia did learn the truth, but this truth did not clarify, it only obscured further. Rather than providing him guidance on what road to follow, the knowledge he gained only calcified his disdain for both the path of light and of darkness, and ensured that in the end, he could not follow either. Aldia gazed upon the roots of the world, and he hated what he saw. They destroyed him, they consumed his very being. The roots are all that's left of him.
These are the roots of our world. Men are props in the stage of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie.
We may also consider Aldia's role in the game relative to the player and his title. Aldia is, in kind of an overly literal sense, a tree of knowledge. He possesses information which we, the players, do not. And throughout the course of the game, he uses this information to suggest alternate paths, to pull us away from the path of fire. Aldia is called the Scholar of the First Sin, which in Dark Souls refers to Gwyn's decision to link the fire, but in the Christian tradition refers to the decision by Adam and Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This choice gets them cast out of eternity, and in a sense, it is the moment at which they become truly human, ephemeral and sinful. Dark Souls' take on the First Sin has always been something of an inversion of this classical archetype. In this instance, it is Gwyn, the supposed god of the story, who commits the sin, and who robs mankind of their promised paradise in the Age of Darkness. Aldia's story is also an inversion of this archetype, but in a different manner. Rather than forfeiting eternity to attain true wisdom, Aldia comes into wisdom, attains genuine understanding, but at the cost of his humanity. Eternity is, for him, a punishment, a cruel twist of fate. And if we consider Aldia's role in relation to us, as an oracle tempting us away from the path of fire, and perhaps to a fate not so unlike his own, then Aldia is very much like the biblical tree of knowledge. Through him, we too can gaze upon the world's roots and see the Age of Fire for what it truly is. The only question is, will these roots swallow you like they did Aldia? The flames are another interesting detail, and I think there are lots of ways you might want to read them. Aldia was, his entire life, torn between his disdain for Gwyn and the unfortunate fact that he really liked the world that fire created, the world Gwyn left him with. He liked being alive, and he came to understand his own life as one which was sustained, at least in part, by the first flame and the Age of Fire. He loved that world and couldn't give it up, even as his refusal to do so brought him closer and closer to ruin. If the branches and roots represent the inhuman stasis which freed him from the curse, then perhaps the flame exists in opposition to that stasis, a tension which Aldia was never able to resolve. I do think it's worth noting, however, that Aldia is not the first character in the Souls series to have been led to their doom by a hubristic desire to overcome the first flame or an overwhelming love of life. The Bed of Chaos gets a lot of shit. Fair enough, but I think we can see in her story a number of parallels to the eventual fate of the Scholar of the First Sin. The Witch of Izalith sought to create new life and a new first flame, and she did succeed, but most likely not in the way she had hoped to. Aldia hoped to cure the curse, and he did succeed, but not in the way he had hoped to. The Chaos Flame grew out of control, swallowing her and her children and birthing the demons. Lost Izalith is covered in massive branches and roots, as is Mother Izalith herself. And like Aldia, if you look really closely at her, you can make out the ghostly form of a woman in the flames. Unlike Aldia, we never get to speak to Izalith herself. We can't know what she might be feeling about the demons she created or about the fates of her children. All we can do is pick up the scattered, broken pieces of her world and guess. Aldia will tell you that he's lost everything, but I wonder if Izalith feels the same. The Looking Glass Knight is one of the best fights in Dark Souls 2, and one of the most visually interesting of the entire Souls series. A battle between the player and a towering knight clad in steel, polished to a mirror sheen, with a massive mirror for a shield. But the identity of the knight in question is left really ambiguous. Who's holding up the mirror is far less important than what you see in it. The knight guards the way to King Vendrick, and after defeating it you'll speak with Aldia, who will ask what it is that you seek. But the knight asks you the same question, albeit silently. It holds a mirror to your face and asks what you're looking for. What do you hope to find in King Vendrick which you do not already possess? We're introduced to the once great kingdom of Drangleic and left to wonder how something so mighty could have crumbled. But as we play through the game, we see the remains of many kingdoms, each of which were mighty, perhaps even more so than Drangleic, and they all fell to ruins just the same. Viewed from this angle, the futility of it all becomes so apparent. Everything you are and everything you do will crumble away. This is the fate of all monarchs as surely as it is the fate of all ephemeral creatures. Vendrick was just a man, a coward who lacked the courage to face his fate, a vulture who sent his countrymen to their deaths in a war of conquest only to turn tail and slink away when his actions caught up to him. You've gone on this journey to find a cure for your curse, to escape the fate of hollowing. Surely if anyone can aid you in that journey, it's Vendrick, king of Drangleic. But he can't. Vendrick can't tell you what you want to know. There's nothing he knows that you don't. And when finally you get the chance to see the king, and you come to know that he fell to the same curse which now afflicts you, you realize that you've seen him before. You saw him reflected in the Looking Glass Knight. When I started writing this script, I didn't plan to cover the Fume Knight or the Royal Aegis, not because I don't find them interesting, but because so many others have already explored them at length and in such detail that I felt like there wasn't much I could add. Still, there is one thing I find interesting about them that I haven't heard brought up before. They are pristine, and pristine in spite of some pretty degrading circumstances. Velstadt has been locked away beneath Drangleic Castle. He guards a shambling corpse, the rotting shell of his former lord. Rain, the Fume Knight, guards a literal corpse, not even a hollowed facsimile, just the charred remains of Nadalia buried beneath the ashen ruins of the Iron Kingdom. These aren't great places to end up, but from dueling them, from battling them, you would never know it. They so thoroughly maintain their former regality, their essential character as people. And given the game that they're in, I find that extremely interesting. To state the obvious, Dark Souls 2 is incredibly fixated on the failings of its cast. Each of them bears a crippling flaw, some trait essential to their character as people which ultimately leads to their doom. The Iron King was consumed by greed, Vendrick by fear, Aldia the love of life, Mitha a desire to be loved, even the Chandra was in some sense done in by her insatiable wanting. It was want that led her to Vendrick and ultimately to you, the one who would put her to rest. All of these figures, by the time you meet them, have been wickedly transformed by their impulses, often as a kind of poetic justice. You know, the Iron King wanted more stuff, and eventually he obtained so much that he sank into the earth, became one with the molten metal which was the object of his obsession. Mitha wanted to be loved, to feel beautiful. To that end, she turned to poison, which turned her into a monster and only made her feel more alone. Her feelings of shame were so intense that she ripped off the faces of her subjects for looking at her. You get it, right? It's all pretty on the nose. So then, why are Rhaem and Velstadt so pristine? A close look at Velstadt's soul will reveal that he has been tainted by the Abyss, but without looking at his soul, you'd never know it. Nothing about him seems to have degraded, not his wits, not his skill, not the sheen of his armor. The same is true for Rhaem. Despite his circumstances, he appears as mighty as he ever was. Perhaps you want to conclude that their desires were simply more noble, more selfless than the kings and queens of the game, but I don't entirely think that's true. Aldia's love of life led him to do vile things, but was the love of life itself such a heinous sin? What about the desire to be loved? Was it really so vile a crime as to warrant becoming a monster? And besides, both Rhaem and Velstadt are where they are for ultimately selfish reasons. They are chasing after their own objects of desire and of lust, and they're more than willing to kill for them. So, why do they get to stay human when all the others did not? Well, I think it comes down to agency. The Iron King never wanted to sink into oblivion. Vendrick never wanted to go hollow. These were fates met as a consequence, a byproduct of the desires of these men. But all Velstadt ever wanted was to guard his lord, and after leaving Drangleic, all Rhaem ever wanted was to guard Nadalia. He stayed by her side, even as it meant being buried in ash, because this tragic fate is one that he wanted, one that he chose of his own free will. If it meant he could stay by her side, he was more than willing to be buried in ash, and thus, even in ash, he remains who he's always been. Even in darkness, Velstadt remains the Royal Aegis. As a small aside, I think this analysis also applies to the Ivory King. I feel the need to bring him up because I've talked about him before and really did not do his character justice, but this is principally what separates the Ivory King from all the rest. When the old chaos appeared and when his might could not stop it, the Ivory King offered himself willingly to keep its hunger at bay. This man is burning in hell, there's no other way to describe it, but from the way he appears before you, you would never know it. Vendrick is a shambling corpse. The Sunken King got f***ed so thoroughly we never even see him. The Iron King is basically the devil, but the Ivory King, burnt though his armor may be, stands proud. He did what all the rest could not. He chose his own fate. Gwyn sought to preserve the Age of Fire, no matter the cost. The First Flame is a complicated instrument. It does a lot of things. Before fire was born, nothing existed in states of change. The world was entirely void of contrast. Fire is responsible for all forms of disparity, heat and cold, light and dark, life and death, even the passage of time. If the fire goes out, at least some of those things will no longer exist, at least not in the way they did before. What is cold without heat? What is darkness without light? What would become of the more metaphysical aspects of disparity, like life and death? It's possible to make an educated guess, but the truth is that no one really knows what an age of darkness would entail, what it would mean for its inhabitants, and so it's possible to imagine all sorts of reasons why someone might not want the flame to go out. Yes, the First Flame gives Gwyn power, but it's more complicated than that, isn't it? It's also responsible for the shape and form of the world, and as Aldia would eventually demonstrate, it's entirely possible for someone other than Gwyn to fall in love with the Age of Fire, and for that love to prevent them from letting it go. I've always been a proponent of a more nuanced reading of the First Sin because I believe in a more nuanced reading of the First Flame. But as I pointed out in the section on the Rotten and Nito, I don't think Gwyn had much respect for the Age of Fire in its totality, because in order to preserve the flame he was willing to disrupt death, an aspect of disparity and a core component of the Age of Fire. We talk often about light and darkness as though the two are wholly opposites, entirely at odds in Dark Souls. But remember, darkness was also a product of fire, and thus darkness was meant to have a place in the Age of Fire. Fire cannot burn without casting a shadow. But Gwyn never accepted the dark, nor the race of men who embodied it, and I think that's because this relationship only goes one way. Darkness may belong in the Age of Fire, but light has no place in the Age of Darkness. Gwyn shackled mankind with the dark sign, stole from them the fate of death in order to keep the flames lit. And so, in a very real sense, Gwyn's actions did not preserve the Age of Fire, only the parts of it that mattered to him. In Dark Souls 1, hollowing is a curse, a sickness spreading through the world, almost as if to suggest that the fire is being kept alive long past the point that it was meant to die. And Gwyn is Patient Zero, the origin point from which all of this corruption stems. I can't say exactly why Gwyn linked the fire, I don't think anyone can. All I can say is that even as he claimed to be preserving the world's order, his hollowed out form reminds us of all that the world has lost, all that he took from it. The ultimate tragedy of Gwyn, I think, is that linking the flame, preserving the Age of Fire, it's a contradiction in terms. You cannot truly love the Age of Fire unless you're willing to accept its most fundamental characteristic: change. All things change and all things end, even the fire itself. Well, that was a honker, wasn't it? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you had a good time. I hope you got something out of at least one of those analyses, character analyses, design analyses, whatever the hell I just did. I hope it didn't make your life worse, I guess is what I'm gonna say. Thank you all for your patience. These past couple months, finals were pretty nuts. I look forward to hearing your own thoughts if you've got any. As always, be safe and may the flames guide your way.